It all started with the smell of dust and decay. That's the first thing I remember, the scent that clung to my clothes and hair for weeks. It was the smell of my inheritance, Blackwood Press, my grandmother's publishing house. It sat on a forgotten corner in a part of the city that was desperately trying to be fashionable again, a 3-story brick monolith of a building, stubbornly refusing to crumble. To my family, it was nothing more than a stubborn old building, a dead asset, a ghost haunting, a prime piece of real estate. To me, my name is Valerie. It was the last piece I had left of my grandmother, Eleanor. And it was failing. The ledgers, what little I could decipher of them, were bleeding red ink. The machinery in the basement was silent, coated in a fine layer of grime. The shelves were filled with unsold books from a bygone era, slim volumes of poetry, and dense academic histories that nobody read anymore. My family saw a simple solution, a lucrative one. They saw a check with a lot of zeros from a developer who wanted to tear down the past and build luxury condos with artisanal coffee shops on the ground floor. They saw an end to the problem. I, on the other hand, was the problem. The meeting took place not in a sterile boardroom, but in my mother's living room, a place meticulously designed to look casually wealthy, a stage for her life. The air was thick with the cloying scent of potpourri and entitlement. My mother Beatrice sat in her favorite armchair, a throne of cream-colored leather, her posture radiating a kind of pained patience, as if dealing with me was a cross she had to bear. My older brother Marcus, the golden child, lounged on the sofa, scrolling through his phone, already spending the money in his head. He had the easy confidence of a man who had never once in his life faced a real consequence. Beatrice cleared her throat, a sound that always signaled the beginning of a lecture. "Valerie, darling," she began, her voice smooth as polished stone. "We need to talk about the press. Marcus and I had a very productive meeting this morning." The "we" hung in the air, a deliberate exclusion. They had met with the developers, behind my back. Of course they had. I felt the familiar, dull ache of being an afterthought in my own family. A meeting? About what? I asked, keeping my voice level, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Marcus finally looked up from his phone, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. "About our future, Val, about unlocking the value tied up in that old relic. The offer from Sterling Development is substantial, life-changing, really." He said our future, but he meant his future. His latest venture, some app that was supposed to revolutionize the pet-sitting industry, was, as usual, hemorrhaging money. My money, mostly, from a series of loans I was never expected to ask to be repaid. My mother slid a glossy folder across the coffee table. It landed with a soft, final thud. Inside were architectural renderings of a glass and steel monstrosity, the name The Blackwood Lofts emblazoned across the top in a soulless font. They had already named it. They had already erased my grandmother's legacy and slapped her name on its tombstone. "It's a very generous offer, Valerie," my mother said, her eyes fixed on me, searching for any sign of weakness. "Enough for a very comfortable retirement for me, and it will give Marcus the capital he needs to really make a go of his business. And you," she added, as if suddenly remembering I was part of the equation, "you'll have a lovely nest egg. You can finally take a nice vacation. You deserve it." Deserve it? The words were a casual slap, as if a vacation could compensate for this betrayal. They didn't see a legacy of words and ink. They saw a pile of bricks they could cash in. They saw my grandmother's life's work as a barrier to their own comfort. "I haven't decided if I'm selling," I said, the words feeling small and defiant in the heavy silence. Marcus scoffed, a short, ugly sound. "What is there to decide? It's a failing business, Val. It was failing when Gran was alive, and she actually knew how to run it. No offense, you're being sentimental. It's not a healthy way to manage an asset." Asset. That's all it was to them. I looked from my brother's dismissive face to my mother's carefully neutral one. I saw the narrative they had constructed. I was the difficult, emotional daughter, standing in the way of progress, clinging to a dusty past out of foolish sentimentality. It was a role they had cast me in for years, and I had always foolishly played my part, the responsible one, the reliable one. The one who cleaned up messes and wrote checks and never asked for anything in return. "The will left the press to me," I stated, my voice a little stronger this time. "Gran left it to me, not to us. The decision is mine." My mother's face tightened, the mask of patience slipped, revealing the cold steel beneath. "Don't be difficult, Valerie. Your grandmother was an old woman. She probably wasn't thinking clearly. She would want what's best for the family." What's best for the family? It was their favorite line, a cudgel they used to beat any dissenting opinion into submission. It never meant what was best for all of us. It meant what was best for them. "I need time to think," I said, standing up. The folder on the table felt like a bomb. "The offer expires in 30 days, Marcus said, his tone sharp, urgent. "My investors aren't going to wait forever. Don't screw this up for us." For us. I walked out of that room without another word, the scent of potpourri clinging to me like a shroud. The drive back to my small apartment felt unreal, the city lights blurring through the tears I refused to let fall. It wasn't just about a building, it was about respect. It was about the casual, breathtaking cruelty of them erasing my grandmother, and by extension, me. They hadn't just presented an offer, they had presented me with a summary of my entire life within my family. My role was to facilitate their dreams, and my own feelings were an inconvenience. That night, sitting alone in my silent apartment, I knew something had to change. It wasn't about revenge. Not yet. At that point, it was about survival. It was about finding out if there was anything left of my grandmother or of myself in the dusty, decaying heart of Blackwood Press. The days that followed that disastrous family meeting were a blur of hollow quiet and simmering anger. I went to my job at the city library, shelving books and answering questions, my mind a million miles away, lost in the echoing silence of my mother's living room. The words "don't screw this up for us" played on a loop, each repetition a fresh twist of the knife. They saw me as a faulty component in their machine, a bug in their financial software. They couldn't comprehend that I might have my own thoughts, my own sense of duty. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of fending off passive-aggressive texts from my mother and outright demanding ones from Marcus, I couldn't bear the thought of my sterile, quiet apartment. On impulse, I drove to Blackwood Press. The key, a heavy, old-fashioned iron thing, felt cold and solid in my hand. Letting myself in, I was hit again by that smell, not of decay this time, but of history. Old paper, leather bindings, the faint metallic tang of ink that seemed to have soaked into the very walls. It was the smell of my grandmother's hands. I walked through the darkened front office, my footsteps echoing on the worn floorboards. I ran my hand along a towering shelf of books, their spines faded and cracking. These were my grandmother's choices, her passions. Were they really as worthless as my family believed? I felt a profound sense of failure, both hers and mine. She had trusted me with this, and all I could see was its demise. All my family could see was a dollar sign. The weight of it all pressed down on me, and I sank onto the creaking steps of the staircase that led to the upper floors, buried my face in my hands, and finally let the tears come. It was a quiet, desolate kind of grief. I was mourning my grandmother, yes, but I was also mourning the family I wished I had, the one that would have gathered in this building and shared stories, not calculated its demolition value. In that moment of despair, my mind drifted back, searching for an anchor. A memory surfaced, sharp and clear. I was 8 years old, and Gran Eleanor had brought me here on a Saturday. My mother had protested, of course. "Mother, it's so dirty, she'll ruin her dress." But Gran had just smiled her quiet, unshakable smile. "Nonsense, Beatrice. A little ink never hurt anyone. It builds character." She had led me down to the printing press in the basement, a massive cast-iron beast that looked like a sleeping dragon. She'd let me put my hand on its cool metal flank. "This is where the magic happens, Valerie," she'd whispered, her eyes shining. "You take a thought, just a wisp of an idea in someone's head, and you give it a body, you give it a voice that can last forever." She showed me the heavy trays of lead type, let me hold a single, cool letter A in my palm. "Never underestimate the power of a single letter," she'd said. "Put enough of them together in the right order, and you can change the world." My mother had never understood that. To her, the press was just noisy, greasy machinery. To my grandmother, it was a conduit for magic, and she had tried to show it to me. Another memory, more recent and far more bitter, pushed its way forward. Marcus, 2 years ago, sitting at my kitchen table, his face a mask of practiced distress. His first app, a social network for amateur chefs, had crashed and burned. He needed $20,000 to pivot. That was his word, pivot, not start over, not pay off the debts from my last failure. He made it sound so strategic, so forward-thinking. My mother had called me beforehand. He just needs a little help to get back on his feet, darling. It's what families do. We support each other. I remember the feeling of my own savings, the money I'd been carefully putting aside for a down payment on a small house, draining away with a few clicks on my banking app. Marcus had given me a quick, distracted hug. "You're the best, Val. I'll pay you back as soon as this thing takes off." He never mentioned it again, and when I'd seen him a month later, he was driving a new car. When I'd asked, he just laughed. "Gotta look successful to be successful, you know?" My mother had beamed with pride. They saw his reckless spending as ambition, and my cautious saving as a lack of vision. I wasn't a sister. I was a line of credit, a safety net he never had to acknowledge. This pattern of being the family's silent, unthanked provider wasn't new. It had been my role for as long as I could remember. My phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me from the past. It was a text from my best friend, Clara. "You okay? Radio silence is not your style." I called her, my voice thick with unshed tears. I told her everything: the meeting, the lofts, the condescending remarks, the weight of the 30-day deadline. I expected sympathy, but Clara gave me something better: righteous fury. "Are you kidding me?" she seethed through the phone. "They named the condos after they bulldoze your grandmother's life's work? The absolute predatory gall of those people." Clara was a historian, a researcher for a documentary film company. She understood legacy. She understood the texture of the past. She also understood being undervalued. "It's funny," she said, her voice turning wry. "I had a meeting today, too. I pitched this incredible story I've been researching for 6 months, a forgotten female photojournalist from the Spanish Civil War. I had everything: letters, diaries, the negatives. My boss, Kevin, listened to the whole thing, nodded and said, 'Great stuff, Clara. Really solid research.' Then this afternoon, an email goes out. Kevin is now heading up a new project on a forgotten female photojournalist. My project. My name wasn't mentioned anywhere in the email. He just took it." The parallel was sickeningly perfect. 2 men, my brother and her boss, taking what wasn't theirs, confident that the women who did the work would just stand by and let them. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but I'm not letting him get away with it. And neither should you. They don't see you, Val. They see an obstacle, a sentimental girl in the way of their payday. You know what you have to do, don't you?" Her words cut through my despair, crystallizing it into something hard and clear: resolve. I wasn't going to be their obstacle anymore. I was going to be a wall. "They think this place is dead," I said, my voice low, looking around the cavernous, silent press room. "They think it's an empty shell." "So prove them wrong," Clara said, her voice firm. "Find out what's really in there. What did Eleanor actually leave you? Not the asset, but the legacy." After I hung up, I sat in the darkness for a long time, the silence no longer feeling oppressive, but full of potential. My family thought I was clinging to the past out of weakness. But what if the past was where the power was? What if, buried in all this dust and paper, there was a voice? My grandmother's voice, a voice she had wanted me to hear. That was the moment the switch flipped, the despair washed away, replaced by a cold, quiet anger. It wasn't just about defending my grandmother's memory anymore. It was about defending myself. A thought, cold and sharp, pierced through my grief. It wasn't about revenge, until it was. I stood up, my back straight. I walked up the creaking stairs, past the offices, to the 3rd floor. There was a small apartment up there where my grandmother had sometimes stayed when she was working late. It was dusty, neglected, but it had a bed, a small kitchen, a bathroom. It had everything I needed. I pulled my phone out and sent a single text message to both my mother and my brother. I'm moving into the press. I need time to go through everything properly. I'll be in touch when I've made a decision. I didn't wait for a reply. I turned the phone off. The silence that followed was the most freeing sound I had ever heard. I was no longer waiting for their approval or fearing their disappointment. I was drawing a line, not in the sand but in the dust of my inheritance, and I was daring them to cross it. That night, I didn't go back to my apartment. I stayed. I slept in my grandmother's old bed, the scent of old books my only blanket. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was home. The decision to move into the apartment above Blackwood Press was the first real act of defiance in my life, and it felt like stepping into another world. The city's noise was muted up here, replaced by the groans and sighs of an old building settling into its bones. For the first few days, I did nothing but exist within its walls. I cleaned. I swept away decades of dust, washed the grimy windows until watery sunlight streamed in, and aired out the stale rooms. It was a physical, repetitive task, and with every swipe of a rag, I felt like I was clearing the fog from my own mind. My family's frantic texts and voicemails, which I checked once a day on my phone, seemed to come from a different planet. They ranged from my mother's feigned concern, "Valerie, darling, we're worried. Is it safe there?" to Marcus's barely veiled threats, "This is seriously messing with my timeline, Val. The developers are getting nervous." I ignored them all. They were just noise. My focus was here, in the quiet. My real work began in my grandmother's office. It was a room frozen in time, exactly as she had left it. A heavy oak desk dominated the space, its surface clear except for a tarnished brass lamp and a pen holder. The walls were lined with bookshelves, but unlike the ones downstairs, these weren't filled with published works. They were sagging under the weight of ledgers, file boxes, and binders, the mundane guts of a business. My heart sank a little. This was what I had to wade through. This was the failing enterprise my family saw. For a week, I did just that. I opened ledger after ledger, my fingers getting stained with ink. The numbers told a grim story, a slow, steady decline over the last 20 years. Profits shrinking, costs rising. I saw desperate notes in the margins, ideas for new book series that were never launched, marketing plans that were never funded. It was a slow, painful death, recorded in meticulous handwriting. I could feel my grandmother's frustration in the cramped numbers, her hope in the unpaid invoices from small, independent bookstores that had probably gone under themselves. I started to understand my family's perspective. From a purely business standpoint, they were right. This place was a mausoleum. One afternoon, my friend Clara came by, bringing a peace offering of coffee and sandwiches. She found me on the floor, surrounded by a mountain of paper, my face smudged with dust. "Find any buried treasure?" she asked, her tone light. "Only a treasure trove of debt and disappointment," I sighed, gesturing at the stacks of files. "I think they might be right, Clara. Maybe I am just being sentimental." "I don't believe that," she said, sitting down beside me and taking a sip of her coffee. "Eleanor was a smart woman. There's something here you're not seeing yet." She looked around the office, her historian's eye taking in the details. "It's all so orderly, so meticulously archived. But this bookshelf," she said, pointing to a massive dark oak case against the far wall, "it feels different." She was right. While the other shelves were a chaotic jumble of files, this one was pristine. It held leather-bound editions of the classics, Dickens, Austen, the Bronte sisters. It looked decorative, a piece of furniture more than a functional shelf. It was also the only thing in the room I hadn't touched, because it seemed too heavy to move and too perfect to disturb. "It's just for show, I think," I said. "Gran loved the classics." Clara stood up and ran her hand along the polished wood. "Maybe." She crouched down, her eyes scanning the floor. "That's odd." She pointed to a spot on the floorboards, just under the edge of the bookcase. There were a series of deep, parallel scratches in the wood, as if the heavy piece had been moved back and forth many times. But it was flush against the wall. It looked like it hadn't been moved in 50 years. Curiosity piqued. We both started pushing. It was incredibly heavy, but after a few moments of straining, it groaned and scraped backwards, revealing the marks on the floor. and behind it, on the floral-papered wall, was something that made my breath catch in my throat. A thin, almost invisible vertical line, and a small, inset brass keyhole that had been hidden by the bookcase's ornate base. It wasn't a wall. It was a door. A vault. My hands were shaking as I searched my grandmother's desk. In the back of the bottom drawer, tucked inside a worn copy of Jane Eyre, was a small, ornate brass key. It fit the lock perfectly. With a heavy, grinding click, the lock disengaged. I pulled, and a section of the wall swung silently inward, revealing a dark, closet-sized space. It smelled different in here. Not of dust, but of dry, clean paper and something faintly floral, like lavender. Inside, there were no business records, no sacks of cash. There were dozens of sturdy, acid-free archival boxes, each one neatly labeled with a single name, not a real name, but a pseudonym. Cassandra, Juno, Minerva, Artemis. My heart was pounding. I lifted the lid off the box marked Cassandra. It was filled with letters, tied in silk ribbons. The paper was thick and creamy, covered in elegant, furious handwriting. I picked up the top letter. "Dearest E," it began. E for Eleanor. "The bastards sent it back again," the letter read. "They said the protagonist was unlikable and shrill. What they mean is that she is a woman who wants something other than a husband and a new set of curtains. They want me to soften her, to make her more palatable to the male reader. They want me to gut her. I would rather burn the manuscript and let them geld my work. You are my only hope." It was signed simply, C. I opened another box. Juno. The letters inside were typed on a different machine, the tone more academic, but just as fierce. They speak of obscenity, E, but the only obscenity is the silence they demand from us. The book is an honest look at a woman's body, at a woman's desires. If that is obscene, then I am an evangelist for obscenity. Will you publish it? No one else has the courage. I sank to the floor. The letters spread around me. This was my grandmother's secret. My quiet, proper, church-going grandmother, who wore tweed skirts and sensible shoes, was a secret publisher of radical, subversive, feminist literature. She was the safe harbor for these women, the anonymous writers from the 1950s and 60s who were pushing back against a world that wanted them to be silent and decorative. The failing, old-fashioned publishing house wasn't a relic, it was a front. Then I saw the other boxes. Tucked beneath the correspondence in each one was a manuscript, thick stacks of typed pages, covered in handwritten notes, corrections, and additions. I lifted one out of Cassandra's box. The title page was simple, "The Glass Garden," and beneath the title, a signature. Not Cassandra, but a name I recognized instantly. A name that belonged to one of the most celebrated, reclusive, and brilliant authors of the century. A woman whose early work was rumored to have been lost in a fire. This wasn't just a manuscript. This was a literary holy grail. I opened another box, and another. Each one contained a secret masterpiece. Unpublished novels, collections of poetry, searing essays, all signed with the author's real names. These weren't just influential writers, these were the titans, and my grandmother had been their confidante, their champion, their secret weapon. "Valerie." Clara's voice was a whisper. She had been reading over my shoulder, her face pale with awe. "Do you understand what this is?" "I think so," I stammered, my mind reeling. "No, you don't," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. "This isn't just a collection of books. This changes things. The biographies, the literary criticism, the university courses. They're all incomplete. This rewrites the entire history of 20th century women's literature. Your grandmother wasn't just a publisher, Val. She was a revolutionary." I looked at the boxes, at the names, at the powerful, dangerous words they contained. The weight of my inheritance suddenly shifted. It was no longer a burden of debt and decay. It was a legacy of fire and courage, and it was all mine. I knew, with absolute certainty, that I couldn't tell my family. They would see this treasure not as a cultural milestone, but as a bigger, better lottery ticket. They would demand I sell it to the highest bidder, to break up the collection and auction it off piece by piece to private collectors where it would disappear forever. I needed help, not from a lawyer who worked on property deals, but from someone who would understand the sanctity of what I had found. Clara knew a man. Mr. Abernathy, she said. He was the head archivist at the university library for 40 years. He's retired now, but his entire life has been about preserving exactly this kind of history. He's discreet. He's the best. The next day, I met Mr. Abernathy at a small coffee shop, a bundle of nerves. He was a small, bird-like man with kind eyes and a tweed jacket that had seen better days. I was vague, telling him only that I had found some old family papers I needed help identifying. I slid a single letter from Cassandra and the title page of The Glass Garden across the table in a protective sleeve. He adjusted his spectacles and peered at the documents. He read the letter slowly, his expression shifting from mild interest to intense focus. Then he looked at the signed title page. His hand, holding his coffee cup, began to tremble slightly. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a reverence that bordered on shock. "My dear girl," he whispered, his voice raspy with emotion. "Where did you find these?" "In my grandmother's publishing house," I said. "There's more, a lot more." He took a slow, deep breath, his scholarly composure completely gone, replaced by the pure, unadulterated joy of a true believer who has just witnessed a miracle. "These are not just old family papers," he said, his voice shaking. "This is a Rosetta Stone for modern literature. This is everything." I walked out of that coffee shop feeling like a different person. My purpose was no longer just to save a building. It was to honor a secret sisterhood, to unleash the voices my grandmother had so carefully protected. The plan began to form in my mind, no longer a vague notion of defiance, but a clear, sharp strategy. My family wanted to bulldoze Blackwood Press. I was about to rebuild it into an empire they couldn't possibly imagine, and they would be the last to know. The 30-day deadline on the developer's offer, which had once felt like a guillotine hanging over my head, now felt like a starting pistol. I had a secret, a treasure of immense cultural and financial value, and I had exactly 1 month to turn it into a fortress. My first move had to be silent, swift, and utterly invisible to my family. They were expecting me to crack under the pressure, to come crawling back, ready to sign their papers. Let them wait. Let them think I was up in my dusty apartment, paralyzed by sentimentality. The reality was a whirlwind of covert activity. Mr. Abernathy became my general, operating with the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent his life in the hushed halls of archives. He was my guide through a world I didn't know existed. Our base of operations was the press itself, the doors locked, the curtains drawn. "The first rule," he'd said, his eyes twinkling with newfound purpose, "is that we create a complete inventory. We must know exactly what we have before we can decide what to do with it." So we began the painstaking process of cataloging the vault's contents. For days that bled into nights, we worked under the glow of the old brass lamp on Eleanor's desk. We wore white cotton gloves, handling the manuscripts and letters as if they were sacred relics. Mr. Abernathy would read a passage from a letter aloud, his voice filled with wonder, and the room would fill with the presence of these brilliant, defiant women. It felt like a séance. We were communing with ghosts, and they were telling us their secrets. As we worked, a subplot of my grandmother's life began to emerge from the letters. She wasn't just their publisher. She was their friend, their confessor, their co-conspirator. They wrote to her about their divorces, their fears, their small victories. Juno, a renowned sociologist in her public life, wrote about the terror of her husband finding her manuscript. "He would have me committed," she wrote. "My grandmother had arranged for a secret post office box a town away for her to use." Cassandra wrote about her struggles with depression, and Eleanor had sent her back letters filled not with platitudes, but with fierce, loving encouragement and the address of a discreet female doctor. She had built a community, a lifeline for women drowning in the expectations of their era. While Mr. Abernathy focused on the historical significance, I, with Clara's help, tackled the modern-day logistics. Clara, fueled by the injustice at her own job, became a master of corporate espionage on my behalf. Okay, she'd say, huddled over her laptop at the press's kitchen table. First, we need to understand the legal structure of Blackwood Press. We found the incorporation documents. My grandmother had set it up as a privately held corporation. And in her will, she hadn't just left me the building, she had left me her entire stake, 100% of the voting shares, and appointed me as the sole director of the board. The language was ironclad. My mother and Marcus had no legal claim to the business itself, only to a share of the estate's residual value if it were liquidated. Their lawyers' threats were a bluff, designed to scare me. They were counting on me not doing my homework. My next call was to an intellectual property lawyer Clara found, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Thea, who specialized in literary estates. I met her in a discreet office downtown, bringing with me a small representative sample of the collection, authenticated by a preliminary report from Mr. Abernathy. Thea's reaction was far more contained than the archivist's, but no less impactful. She looked at the documents, her face unreadable, and then looked at me. "The value here is staggering," she said, her voice flat. "But the copyright is everything. Who owns it?" That was the masterstroke of my grandmother's plan. In her letters, she had outlined the agreements she'd made with her writers. They had all agreed, in writing, to assign the copyright of these specific, unpublished works to Blackwood Press in exchange for her promise to protect and, when the time was right, publish them. She had been playing the long game. The press, the failing entity my family despised, was the legal owner of a priceless literary portfolio. "The first thing we do," Thea said, her eyes gleaming with strategic fire, "is register these copyrights immediately. We create an official, unbreakable paper trail. We do it quietly, electronically. By the time anyone knows these works exist, your ownership will be a fait accompli." While Thea built the legal fortress, the pressure from my family was escalating from a nuisance to a siege. The panicked voicemails started. The first was from Marcus. "Val, I just had a call with the developers. They're getting twitchy. They want an answer. What am I supposed to tell them? You're putting my entire funding round at risk. Call me back, now." His voice was tight with a frustration that was rapidly curdling into panic. Then, my mother, "Valerie, this has gone on long enough. I spoke with Robert, our family attorney. He agrees that your refusal to act is a dereliction of your duties as executor. You are actively diminishing the value of the estate. We are prepared to have you removed if you force our hand. This is not a threat. It is a promise. You are tearing this family apart." Tearing the family apart. The irony was so thick, I could have choked on it. They, who had plotted behind my back and treated me like a bank account, were accusing me of being the destructive one. But their words had lost their power over me. They were just buzzing flies, trapped on the other side of a window they couldn't see. I instructed Thea to draft a simple, polite response to their lawyer. It stated that as executor, I was undertaking a thorough inventory of the estate's assets, as was my fiduciary duty, and that I would not be rushed into a premature decision that could potentially undervalue the primary asset, Blackwood Press. It was perfectly professional, perfectly reasonable, and designed to infuriate them with its calm legality. The final piece of the silent takeover was insurance. Mr. Abernathy connected me with a specialist firm that handled fine art and rare documents. A quiet, impeccably dressed man came to the press. He walked through the office, looked into the vault, and spent hours examining the manuscripts. His final valuation, a preliminary number for the insurance policy, was a number so vast it seemed fictional. It was more than 10 times what the developers were offering for the building and the land it stood on. I signed the papers, and suddenly, the dusty collection of paper in the vault was one of the most well-protected literary archives in the country. One evening, after another long day of cataloging, Mr. Abernathy looked at me over the top of his spectacles. "Your grandmother was a brilliant woman, Valerie," he said. "Not just for her literary tastes, but for her foresight. This vault, the corporation, the copyright agreements. This wasn't an accident. She was creating a time capsule. She was waiting for someone who would understand." I looked around the office, at the stacks of boxes filled with the secret lives of incredible women. I felt a profound connection to Eleanor, a sense of shared purpose across the decades. She had built the ship, stocked it with treasure, and set it adrift, trusting that one day the right captain would climb aboard. My family saw a shipwreck to be plundered. I was starting to see a vessel ready to sail. The silent takeover was complete. The fortress was built. Now, all I had to do was wait for the enemy to storm the walls. They wouldn't know until it was too late that the real treasure was already safe inside. The family's response to my lawyer's placid, professional letter was a predictable explosion of impotent fury. The 30-day deadline on the developer's offer passed. The silence from my end was, to them, an act of war. And so they began their campaign of emotional warfare, a clumsy, desperate attempt to regain control. It started with what I can only describe as a social exodus. I was surgically removed from the family narrative, a group chat I hadn't realized I was still in, dedicated to planning my mother's birthday, suddenly went silent. Then I saw on social media that the party had happened without me. There were photos of Beatrice smiling, flanked by Marcus and his new girlfriend Tiffany, raising champagne glasses. My aunt, my cousins, everyone was there, their smiles bright and forced. Someone had even cropped me out of an old family photo they used as a centerpiece. It was petty, childish, and designed to make me feel utterly alone. A few years ago, this would have devastated me. It would have been proof of my worst fear, that I was unlovable, a disappointment. But now, looking at the photos on my phone screen in the quiet solitude of the press, I felt a strange and startling sense of peace. They weren't cutting me out, they were letting me go. The strings of guilt and obligation that had tied me to them for so long were snapping, one by one. Their attempts to isolate me were ironically setting me free. When the silent treatment failed to produce the desired result, my immediate and groveling surrender, they shifted to direct assault. My mother was the first to appear at my gate. I saw her on the old security camera I had rigged up, standing on the sidewalk, looking up at the building with a mixture of anger and bewilderment. I buzzed her in, deciding it was better to face her on my own turf. She swept into the office, which I had cleaned and organized to a state of Spartan order. Her eyes scanned the room, missing the significance of the tidiness, seeing only the lack of modern furniture. "Valerie," she began, her voice dripping with manufactured concern, "I am so worried about you. Living in this place. It's not healthy. You're isolating yourself. We're your family. We love you. We just want what's best for you." It was a masterful performance, the concerned matriarch pleading with her lost, wayward daughter. I just stood there, waiting. "I'm fine, Mom," I said, my voice calm. "I'm just busy." "Busy with what?" she snapped, the facade of concern cracking. "Busy playing make-believe in a museum? The offer is gone, Valerie. You cost us millions of dollars. Millions. For what? So you can hide in this dusty tomb?" "Gran didn't see it as a tomb," I replied, my voice still quiet. "She saw it as a lifeline." "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she scoffed. "Your grandmother was a sentimental old woman who didn't know how to run a business. She would be horrified to see you throwing away our family's future for a pile of old books." The sheer staggering hypocrisy of her words almost made me laugh. She was invoking my grandmother's wishes as a weapon, the same grandmother whose life's work she was desperate to pave over with a parking garage. It was in that moment I realized, with chilling certainty, that my mother was incapable of seeing the world from any perspective but her own. Her empathy was a tool, not a genuine emotion. "The press is not for sale," I said, the words now feeling solid and true in my mouth. "That is my final decision." Her face went from red to a pale, tight-lipped white. "You will regret this, Valerie," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You will end up a lonely old woman in this building, just like she did." She turned and stormed out, slamming the heavy oak door behind her. The silence she left in her wake was a blessing. Marcus's attempt came a few days later. He tried a different tactic, the appeal to our shared history, a history he had largely invented. He cornered me as I was leaving to get groceries. "Val, come on," he pleaded, his voice oozing a sincerity that was as fake as a $3 bill. "Talk to me. It's me, Marcus. Remember when Dad died? Who was there for you?" "I was." It was a low blow and a lie. When our father died 10 years ago, Marcus had been on a surfing trip in Bali. He'd shown up for the funeral, looking tanned and sad, and had borrowed $5,000 from me the next day for a can't-miss investment opportunity. I had been the one to sit with our mother, to handle the paperwork, to pack up our father's things. Marcus had been a ghost. "I remember you were in Bali," I said, my voice flat. He had the grace to look momentarily flustered.
Okay, bad example. But all the other times, I've always had your back. And now, when I finally have a chance to build something real, you're torpedoing it. My investors are gone. The whole deal fell apart because of you.
"Your deal fell apart because it was built on money you didn't have," I corrected him. "It was built on the assumption that you were entitled to sell something that wasn't yours." His face hardened. The friendly, pleading brother vanished, replaced by the entitled man-child I knew so well. "You're just jealous," he spat. "You've always been jealous of me. You have this librarian mentality. You're afraid of risk, afraid of success, so you'd rather sit here and rot with your dusty books than see me succeed." He stormed off, leaving me standing on the sidewalk. Not hurt, but strangely illuminated. He really believed it. In his mind, he was the visionary, and I was the bitter, small-minded spinster holding him back. It was a worldview so profoundly self-serving that it was almost a work of art. The power had well and truly shifted. Their manipulations, once so effective, now felt like wet firecrackers, fizzling out at my feet. They were trying to play a game whose rules I was no longer following. They thought the game was about money and guilt. They had no idea that I was now playing an entirely different game, a game of history, legacy, and power they couldn't even comprehend. The final piece of my plan was to send a flare-up into the sky, a signal to the right people that something was happening at Blackwood Press. On Thea's advice, we didn't go to the major newspapers. That would be too loud, too soon. Instead, she used a discreet contact to leak a single, tantalizing sentence to a prestigious, subscription-only literary review journal, the kind read by academics, auction house specialists, and serious collectors all over the world. The sentence was a masterpiece of understatement. Whispers abound in archival circles of a significant, previously unknown collection of mid-century feminist correspondence and manuscripts recently unearthed at a dormant East Coast publishing house. It named no names, it gave no specifics, it was just a hook, cast into a very specific, very deep pond. We would know soon enough what we had caught. The family exodus was complete. The counter-manipulation had failed, the power had shifted, and they didn't even know it yet. They thought they had lost a battle over a real estate deal. They had no idea they were about to lose a war for history itself. The small anonymous notice in the literary journal was like a single stone dropped into a vast, still lake. The first ripples were subtle. A polite email from a professor of American literature at a major university asking if Blackwood Press had any archival materials that might be of interest for his research. Then a call from a curator at a women's history museum, following up on a curious rumor. Mr. Abernathy fielded these calls with the practiced air of a man guarding a national secret, confirming nothing but hinting at the possibility of a future announcement. The buzz was building, contained within the rarefied world of academia and high-end collecting, a low hum just beneath the threshold of public awareness. My family, of course, heard nothing of this. They were stewing in their own bitter juices, convinced I was sitting alone in my dusty fortress, consumed by regret. The silence from their end stretched for 2 weeks. It was a heavy, resentful silence, the kind that precedes a final, desperate charge. The charge came in the form of a certified letter from their lawyer. It was a formal demand for a meeting to resolve the disposition of the estate's primary physical asset. They were trying to force my hand, to get me into a room where they believed their combined pressure could finally break me. I had Thea accept on my behalf. The meeting was set for the following Friday, at the press. They were walking into my territory, into the heart of my power, and they had no idea. The day of the confrontation, I was preternaturally calm. I chose my outfit carefully, a simple black dress, the kind of thing I would wear to my job at the library. No power suits, no dramatic statements. I wanted them to see the same old Valerie they thought they knew. Mr. Abernathy arrived an hour early, dressed in his best tweed jacket, a folder of carefully selected documents under his arm. He was playing the role of consultant. We set up the conference room, a space I had cleared and polished until the long mahogany table gleamed. They arrived precisely on time, a united front of familial disapproval. My mother, Beatrice, was dressed in a sharp, expensive-looking suit, armor for the battle ahead. Marcus was beside her, his face a mask of sullen anger. He was holding a slim leather portfolio, which I knew contained the ghost of the developer's offer, their last and only weapon. "Valerie," my mother began, foregoing any greeting. Her tone was cold and final. "We are here to put an end to this nonsense. We have been more than patient." I gestured to the chairs opposite me. "Please, sit down." They sat, placing their portfolio on the table between us. It was them against me, just as they'd always wanted. They didn't even seem to register Mr. Abernathy, who sat quietly at the end of the table, an unassuming old man they dismissed as irrelevant. Marcus opened the portfolio. "Despite your behavior," he said, the word dripping with disdain, "the developers are still interested. They've given us a final offer. The number is slightly lower, to account for the delay you caused, but it is still a fortune. This is your last chance to do the right thing for this family." He slid a single piece of paper across the gleaming wood. I didn't even look at it. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment. Then I folded my hands on the table and looked directly at my mother, then my brother. "Blackwood Press is not for sale," I said. My voice was quiet, but it filled the room. Marcus let out a short, humorless laugh. "What are you talking about? We're not leaving until you sign. What are you going to do? Let it rot? Print your own sad little poems?" "No," I said, a faint smile touching my lips for the first time. "I'm going to run it." My mother stared at me as if I had just announced my intention to fly to the moon. "Don't be ridiculous. You know nothing about publishing. This business is dead. It's worthless." "That's where you're mistaken," I said. I looked to Mr. Abernathy, who gave a slight nod. He opened his own folder and slid a single document across the table toward them. It wasn't a developer's offer. It was a one-page summary of an insurance valuation conducted by the specialist firm. My mother picked it up, her brow furrowed in confusion. Marcus leaned over to read it with her. I watched their faces as their eyes scanned the page. I saw the moment their brains processed the number at the bottom. It was a figure with 8 zeros after the initial digit. Beatrice's eyes shot up, wide with disbelief. "What is this? This is—" "That," I explained calmly, "is the insured value of a small portion of the press's unpublished literary assets. It does not include the building, the land, or the rest of the collection." Marcus snatched the paper from his mother's hand, reading it again as if the words might change. "Literary assets? What literary assets? A bunch of dusty old poetry books?" And then, I told them everything. I told them about the hidden vault. I told them about the letters, the secret correspondence between my quiet, traditional grandmother and a secret sisterhood of the most brilliant female writers of her time. I told them about the manuscripts. I named the names, the famous, the revered, the legendary. I told them that Blackwood Press was the sole copyright holder to a literary treasure trove that was about to rewrite history. The color drained from their faces, the arrogance, the condescension, the certainty. It all evaporated, replaced by a stunned, gaping silence. They looked like fish in a tank, mouths opening and closing, but no sound coming out. "You saw a decaying building," I said, my voice steady and clear, echoing the words I had practiced in my head for weeks. "You saw a pile of bricks you could turn into cash. Grandma didn't leave us a piece of real estate. She left a cultural institution, and she left it to me, because she knew I would understand what it truly was." My mother finally found her voice. It was a strangled whisper. "The money, that valuation, we're rich." I shook my head slowly. "No, you're not." I gestured to the papers Thea had prepared for me. "According to my grandmother's will and the corporate charter of Blackwood Press, I am the sole director and shareholder. The assets belong to the press. And the press's profits, I continued, delivering the final, killing blow, will be reinvested into its mission. We are relaunching. We will publish these lost works. And we will be using the subsequent profits to establish the Eleanor Blackwood Grant, a foundation to support a new generation of underrepresented female writers. I paused, letting the full weight of it land. There will be no quick payout. There will be no lump sum. There is no money for a new app or a comfortable retirement. The legacy is not for sale. The silence that followed was absolute. The shock on their faces slowly curdled into something ugly, the impotent rage of thwarted greed. Marcus stared at me, his expression a mixture of hatred and awe. My mother just looked broken, defeated. The world she had so carefully constructed, a world that revolved around her own desires, had just been demolished. "You did this to spite us," she finally whispered, her voice trembling. I stood up. The meeting concluded. "No," I said, looking at the woman who was my mother but felt like a stranger. "I did this for my grandmother, and for them." I gestured to the walls, to the building that now pulsed with the energy of all the secrets it held. It was never about revenge, but I have to admit, this feels an awful lot like justice. They left without another word, the glossy developer's portfolio abandoned on the table, a pathetic relic of a future that would never be. I stood in the quiet office, the scent of old paper and ink filling my lungs. The war was over. I had won. In the months that followed, the world discovered what I already knew. The official announcement from the newly relaunched Blackwood Press sent shockwaves through the literary world. The lost archive of Eleanor Blackwood became an international news story. Scholars and reporters flocked to our quiet street, their cameras aimed at the old brick building that had been a ghost just a short time ago. It was no longer a symbol of decay, it was a beacon. The first book we published, The Glass Garden by Cassandra, debuted at #1 on every bestseller list and stayed there for almost a year. It was hailed as a lost masterpiece, a work of stunning power and honesty. The proceeds from that single book were enough to fund the press and the Eleanor Blackwood Grant for the next decade. I hired a small, passionate staff, including Clara, who quit her job the day after the announcement and became my head of research, finally getting the credit she deserved. Mr. Abernathy sat on our board, our wise and gentle guide. We weren't just publishing books, we were fulfilling a promise made by my grandmother half a century ago. The press was alive, vibrant, and more successful than it had ever been. As for my family, their story took a different turn. As I had predicted, they tried to sue. They hired an aggressive lawyer and challenged my grandmother's will, claiming she was not of sound mind and that I had exerted undue influence. But Eleanor, my brilliant, far-sighted grandmother, had been prepared for that too. Tucked away with her corporate papers was a recent notarized letter from her doctor, attesting to her perfect mental clarity and a personal handwritten letter to be opened only in the event of a legal challenge. In it, she laid out in excruciating detail her disappointment in her daughter and grandson. She wrote of their materialism, their lack of respect for her work, and her fear that they would sell her soul for a parking lot. She stated in no uncertain terms that she was leaving the press to me, and only me, because I was the only one who had ever shown an interest in the magic, not the money. When their lawyer read that letter during the deposition, he advised them to drop the case immediately. They were left with nothing but their legal bills and their bitterness. The consequences of their own actions rippled through their lives. Marcus's phantom investors had long since vanished, and without the promise of a family windfall, his credit dried up. He had to sell his flashy car and move into a tiny apartment. The last I heard, he was working a miserable sales job, the visionary genius finally forced to confront reality. My mother, without the safety net of her daughter's income or the promise of a multi-million-dollar buyout, had to sell her meticulously decorated house. She moved into a small condo, her stage for a life of casual wealth gone forever. They never called me. The silence from their end was now permanent. I felt a pang of sadness for the family I had lost, but it was quickly replaced by a profound sense of peace. So, here I am now. I'm sitting in my grandmother's office, at her heavy oak desk. The air still smells of old paper and ink, but it's not a scent of decay anymore. It's the smell of possibility, of voices waiting to be heard. My family accused me of clinging to the past, but they were the ones who were trapped. They were trapped by their own greed, their own limited vision. I wasn't clinging to the past. I was unlocking its secrets to build a new future. They saw a building, a physical asset on a balance sheet. But a legacy isn't something you can measure in square footage or property values. A true legacy is a story. It's a purpose. And my grandmother didn't just leave me a publishing house. She left me a story to finish. She trusted me to be its author. Standing up for yourself, especially against your own family, can feel like the loneliest, most terrifying thing in the world. It feels like you're setting yourself adrift in a vast, empty ocean. But sometimes, you have to do it. You have to choose your own integrity over their expectations. And if you're lucky, you discover that you're not as alone as you think. You discover that you're fighting for a principle, for a truth that is bigger than just you. For me, it was the truth that women's voices matter, that their stories deserve to be told, and that their legacies are worth fighting for. It was a fight I never expected to have, but I will be forever grateful that I found the courage to see it through. I want to ask you, have you ever had to fight for something your family just didn't understand or value? Have you ever had to draw a line and defend it? Let me know your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and if you found some inspiration in this story of how a forgotten past became a powerful future, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. There are always more stories to tell about how the quietest voices can sometimes end up having the last word.